In the winter of 1944, the upper air over the North Pacific formed a fast, cold conveyor from Japan to North America. American meteorologists had sketched versions of this current on pre-war charts, but wartime radio sonde launches made its speed, altitude, and seasonal rhythm hard to ignore. Japanese officers trained in meteorology reached the same conclusion from the other side of the ocean. A light craft, if it could climb into that band at roughly 9 to 12 kilometers, would be carried across in 3 to 5 days without engines, pilots, or fuel. The atmosphere itself could be used as a delivery system. The weapon that grew from this insight was austere: a hydrogen balloon with a barometric regulator and a rack for bombs or incendiaries. Its envelope was made from small gores of laminated washi paper, pasted with plant starches and pressed to a thin, gas-tight skin. The suspension gear was a ribbed wooden and aluminum ring from which hung ballast bags, a simple aneroid-driven release mechanism wired to a rotating carousel, and a modest demolition load. The regulator kept the system within a workable altitude band. When the envelope cooled and lost lift at night, the aneroid closed a circuit and dropped a sandbag. When daytime solar heating brought the balloon up again, a relief valve bled hydrogen to prevent rupture. After a set number of ballast releases, a final circuit armed the charges, intending to erase the evidence somewhere above an American forest or field. Launches began in November 1944 and continued into the spring of 1945. Production lines drew in schoolgirls, factory hands, and local volunteers who laminated paper, cut gores, and checked seams by hand. Hydrogen came from plants near the launch areas. Crews waited for windows when the upper westerlies were strongest. Post-war summaries, based on captured records and interrogations, put the total number of balloons launched on the order of 9,000. The majority failed for ordinary reasons: leaky seams, torn envelopes, insufficient gas, mishandled valves, or bad weather over the Pacific. A small fraction entered the jet stream intact, crossed the ocean, and descended into the air column over North America. The first American notices were accidental. Forest patrols in Oregon and Washington found small, odd fires in winter when fires were not expected. Local sheriffs collected strange fragments: ribbed wooden rings, lengths of rope, sections of metal with unfamiliar holes and threads, and a light silvered paper that delaminated when soaked. Pieces went to Army labs, where analysts compared fibers and glues and found plant pastes and paper types consistent with Japanese manufacture. Sand from ballast bags contained shells and foraminifera traced to Japanese beaches. An initial set of questions, whether the devices might carry biological or chemical agents, was reduced by inspection. Most recovered racks held incendiaries and a small high-explosive bomb, not spray gear or reservoirs. A few carried nothing but incendiaries. Interception was difficult. Balloons were high, slow, and inconspicuous on radar. They reflected poorly and produced few consistent signatures. When observers reported a sighting, fighter squadrons could be scrambled only if weather, daylight, and location cooperated. Even then, by the time aircraft reached altitude, the target had often drifted out of range. Navy ships occasionally fired on drifting envelopes at sea. Some were brought down, most simply disappeared into haze. Domestic policy treated the weapons as a feedback problem. The Office of Censorship urged newsrooms to avoid detailed coverage of balloon landfalls and associated fires. Editors received bulletins with suggested language and cautions. The premise was simple. If newspapers and radio reported precise locations and times, the adversary could adjust launches and improve results. If information stayed vague and fragmented, the planners in Japan would get little signal back. This choice had consequences. In towns where people found debris or heard small explosions in trees, rumors did the work that headlines would have done, and rumors tend to sharpen the fear that official language deliberately dulls. Forest Service logs record a winter with more patrol hours than usual, scattered fires quickly contained, and a steady trickle of calls to county offices about suspicious fragments in woods and fields. The devices produced specific local problems. An Oregon farmer handling a fallen object suffered burns of the hands and forearms. The hospital chart listed the cause as an explosion of unknown origin and recommended reporting to the sheriff. County coroners added lines to their ledgers to capture a category that had not existed before. Power crews logged unexplained short circuits in rural lines. One March 1945 incident affected the grid feeding the Hanford Engineer Works in Washington, where plutonium was being produced for the Manhattan Project. Automatic protection and reserves limited the interruption, but the event illustrated how a light, unguided system could intersect with critical infrastructure by chance. The most serious consequence came on 5th May 1945 near Bly, Oregon, when a fallen balloon's explosive payload detonated during a Sunday outing, killing 6 civilians, 5 children, and a pregnant woman. The incident transformed a technical and administrative problem into a national event. Within days, federal guidance shifted from near silence to public warnings that emphasized caution. Do not touch unfamiliar debris. Notify authorities. Assume danger. Statements avoided technical detail but acknowledged a hazard. For local responders, this change reduced the number of curious hands on unexploded components and gave a clear script to sheriffs, pastors, teachers, and editors struggling to explain a war mechanism that did not look like a weapon. Patterns emerged as reports accumulated. Most recoveries clustered in the American Northwest and Western Canada, with additional incidents in the interior West and a smaller tail into the upper Midwest. Canadian files record balloons in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Alaska produced several entries. Mexico registered a few. Typical finds included scorched patches, fragments of paper envelopes, ballast rings, release gear, and unexploded bombs or incendiary cylinders. Disposal units developed procedures, mark and clear a perimeter, approach from upwind, neutralize charges, bag and label parts, forward to laboratories. The winter climate reduced the chance of large fires. Snow, frost, and wet understory limited ignition. In spring, when forests dried, the jet stream weakened and shifted north, decreasing deliveries. Behind the visible footprint lay a distinctive engineering trade. The barometric regulator, primitive by later standards, was clever for its purpose. Its aneroid bellows drove contacts that sequenced ballast drops through a rotating carousel. Each drop bought altitude on a cold night. Each day, surplus lift vented as heat returned to the envelope. A self-destruct cycle near the end of the carousel attempted to destroy evidence. The flight profile depended on the balance of diurnal heating, hydrogen leakage, and ballast mass, all under the influence of turbulence and vertical shear in the jet stream. Post-war graphs reconstructed likely trajectories. Launch clusters on Honshu, a banded path across the ocean, dispersions widening as the stream meandered, scatter over the continent. For a few balloons, analysis matched a launch window to a recovery point and estimated a transit time of several days. The crude automation succeeded often enough to prove the concept, but the lack of telemetry or observers made the campaign blind to its own results, which in turn prevented informed calibration. American responses represented the home front version of distributed defense. Forest lookouts added winter watch practices normally reserved for late summer. State emergency councils inventoried pumps, hand tools, and vehicles that would otherwise have remained idle in wet months. The Western Defense Command routed observer reports through filter centers that already processed aircraft sightings. The Office of Censorship revised its guidance after the Bly tragedy, and newspapers began to carry cautious accounts. County offices built quiet routines of collection and disposal. None of this resembled a mobilization. All of it consumed attention and time. As the season advanced into late spring, the jet stream weakened and migrated. Reports tapered. Interrogations after the war suggested that Japanese commanders recognized the absence of meaningful feedback, accepted that fire risk in American forests was lowest in the months when the wind was strongest, and exhausted practical stores of envelopes and hydrogen. Launch crews dismantled their field equipment. Workshops closed. In the Pacific, the war moved toward its conclusion by other means. The quantitative record that emerged later was unspectacular and instructive. Of roughly 9,000 balloons launched, about 300 incidents were documented in North America. The number of significant fires remained small. The number of fatalities was 6, all in the single Oregon event. A few near-misses power line contacts, an explosion close to a road crew underline the role of chance. The ratio of inputs to effects reveals the limits of environmental delivery under wartime constraints. The campaign achieved psychological and administrative effects disproportionate to its material scale, but not the persistent disruption its planners imagined. It remains an example of how a well-characterized natural system can inspire a weapon whose elegance outstrips its utility. Long after the war ended, remnants continued to surface. Hike. Several professional communities folded the episode into their institutional memory. Meteorologists adopted the jet stream as a staple of aviation forecasting. Wartime charts became teaching pieces. Foresters retained winter surveillance practices and crafted seasonal cautions for staff and volunteers who worked far from roads. Utility engineers added notes about unusual causes of line faults that could propagate unexpectedly. County emergency managers used the historical case when building public messages that balance urgency with restraint. Even newsrooms kept the censorship bulletins as artifacts of a specific calculus. Deprive the adversary of data without depriving the public of necessary warnings. The human geography fills out the file. A farm family in eastern Oregon adjusted its spring routines after a small, unexplained blaze singed pasture grass. The father rebuilt a fence with char lines still visible on the posts. A power plant supervisor in Washington revised his night shift checklists after the March outage linked to a balloon's trailing wire. His logs include new language about redundancy and black start procedures. A Canadian rancher in the Caribou District described a winter morning spent waiting with a sheriff's deputy while Army ordnance men arrived from hours away to remove a metal cylinder found by a creek. A school district added a unit to its 8th grade curriculum on the hazards of unexploded ordnance and the particular history of the jet stream weapons. None of these episodes made national news. Together they trace a small, quiet footprint across a wide, thinly populated landscape. On the Japanese side, the post-war interviews sketch an organization that combined scientific competence with wartime shortages. Engineers solved the altitude control problem with available components. Production teams overcame material limits by substituting paper and starch for cloth and rubber. Launch officers learned to read upper air soundings and pick windows when the westerlies aligned. What they could not solve within the constraints of 1944-45 Japan was feedback. No aircraft or transmitters accompanied the balloons. No reliable method existed to detect landfalls or fires across the ocean. No signals returned to calibrate release timing, payload choice, or launch intervals. In that sense, the campaign is also an epistemic lesson. Without measurement, even an elegant design drifts. The decision to target forests in winter and early spring reveals a second constraint. The strongest winds coincided with wet, cold months in the Pacific Northwest, when ignition was least likely to spread. If the schedule had shifted later, the winds would have weakened and drifted north, leaving more devices in the ocean or over sparsely inhabited regions. The designers chose correctly for the atmosphere and incorrectly for the fuel bed, and the mismatch was baked into the geometry of the Earth's circulation. Archival summaries from the American side include a small but telling set of statistics that illuminate the administrative cost. Counties that reported balloon incidents logged modest increases in overtime for sheriffs and road crews. Forest districts purchased additional hand tools and small pumps and billed them to wartime contingency funds. State police accumulated film and dossier space for photographs of wreckage. Laboratories spent hours on comparative fiber analysis of paper and glue. None of these costs was large. All were unavoidable once the campaign began. One often cited detail concerns the forensic sand. Ballast, recovered from several sites, contained marine microfossils that laboratory specialists matched to regions of the Western Pacific, an early and public example of how geologists and biologists contribute to attribution. Another detail concerns bomb fusing. Some high-explosive units were armed with simple impact fuses. Others failed to function when the rack landed softly in snow or brush, accounting for many unexploded recoveries. Incendiary cylinders included devices intended to scatter burning compounds through tree crowns. Winter moisture defeated most of these. Over time, disposal units learned to treat the racks as unreliable machines that could still operate unpredictably after days in the open. The Bly Memorial occupies a specific place in the narrative, not because it changes the technical story, but because it anchors the statistics to a named landscape. A forest road leads to a clearing with a plaque. Visitors learn that an excursion encountered a hidden explosive before authorities could publicize clear warnings. The inscription does not discuss jet-level winds or barometers. It fixes the human cost. Historians who study the home front often note that such markers do a separate kind of work from official reports. They stabilize memory in communities where the war otherwise arrived only as newsprint, ration books, and absent relatives. The episode also demonstrates the rarely discussed labor of silence. During the suppression period, editors weighed the risk of aiding an adversary against the duty to inform readers. The Office of Censorship, staffed by civilians and journalists in uniform, wrote memos that tried to thread a narrow needle. After the fatal incident, the position moved. Warnings replaced quiet. In the long view, the policy achieved its narrow aim. No reliable feedback reached the launch planners, while carrying a burden in towns where rumor had to bear the weight that official language refused. The balance would be argued differently in a different era. The record shows how it was argued then. By late summer 1945, the wind conveyor that had carried the balloons weakened with the season. Launches ceased. Engineers in Japan dismantled equipment and returned to depots that were themselves fragmenting under shortages and bombardment. In the United States and Canada, agencies filed their last reports and closed temporary folders. The story did not end in a single moment. It dispersed. Pieces sank under trees, were gathered into boxes, were placed on shelves in county offices, and were later transferred to state archives and small museums. Every few years, a road crew digging a trench or a hunter crossing a slope found a remnant. The routine that had been improvised in 1945, mark, cordon, call, clear persisted as a reflex. From a historian's perspective, the campaign occupies a narrow but suggestive place in the broader Pacific War. It illustrates how a nation under constraint sought an asymmetric effect with modest means, how a home front absorbed a new hazard by extension of ordinary institutions, how a scientific discovery, the mapping of the jet stream, moved quickly from theory to use, and how the physical world itself, indifferent to human plans, set the limits. The operational file closes with a short ledger: thousands launched, hundreds recovered, 6 dead, 1 brush with a secret power plant, minor fires, many fragments, lessons about wind, risk, rumor, and restraint. The atmospheric current that made the attempt possible did not vanish. It remains, charted daily, a standard feature of pilot briefings and weather broadcasts. It moves air across the ocean as steadily now as it did in 1944. What changed was the human frame placed upon it. In one season, it carried paper and explosives toward forests and farms. In later decades, it served as a classroom exhibit and a cautionary example in emergency management seminars. The artifacts left behind, rings, valves, paper strips, shed their original purpose and took on a second life as teaching tools. A long view sets the episode beside other efforts to turn natural flows, wind, currents, rivers, into weapons. The records suggest a recurring pattern. Nature delivers scale, technology supplies precision, strategy demands feedback. The Fugo system had scale without precision and no feedback. It carried engineering charm, not strategic force. Yet even a weak instrument, when multiplied and granted time, becomes a statistic that someone has to manage: a patrol dispatched, a power line checked, a schoolroom warned, a memorial built. The history of the balloons is the history of those small repeated acts of management as much as it is the history of a paper envelope riding a river of air. By the early 1950s, the event had settled into a minor file in state and federal archives. An index card might list balloon, Japanese, see also incendiary, jet stream, censorship. In some counties, clerks could point to a drawer where photographs lay in paper sleeves, a boot toe for scale next to a warped valve, a ring propped on a stump, a scorched patch in snow. The photographs share a subdued palette: grays, damp browns, weathered wood. None includes a person's face. The campaign itself had few faces. It left objects and logs, not portraits. The exception stands near Bly, where names are cut into metal. In summary, the winter of 1944-45 delivered a quiet offensive to the American mainland by means of a strong seasonal wind. The devices were simple and, within limits, effective. The damage they caused was modest by wartime standards, but not trivial to those who experienced it. The American response combined censorship, forestry practice, and routine law enforcement. The Japanese effort highlighted ingenuity under scarcity and the cost of blindness to results. The episode endures because it sits at an intersection where geophysics, improvisation, and local life meet. It reminds readers that a war can arrive not as an army or a fleet, but as fragments on snow, a brief outage on a grid map, an entry in a coroner's book, and a small memorial beside a forest road. The American record that accumulated through the winter of 1944-45 broadened in scope beyond forestry and local law enforcement. The Western Defense Command compiled a running digest of sightings, recoveries, and controlled demolitions across coastal and inland districts. The Army Air Forces circulated technical notes that consolidated laboratory findings from scattered fragments. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened case files that treated each discovery as a potential sabotage lead until proven otherwise. The Office of Scientific Research and Development tracked the forensic trail of ballast materials, envelope fibers, and adhesives, building an attribution mosaic that became steadily more precise without the need for dramatic revelations. Agencies that did not normally share routines, foresters, sheriffs, ordnance officers, utility dispatchers, and editors, were linked by the same quiet problem: an unguided mechanism delivered by a wind whose schedule could not be negotiated. The technical story of the balloons, once the first sets of parts had been catalogued, settled into consistent outlines. The envelope measured roughly 30 feet in diameter at full inflation, built from many small sheets of washi laminated into gores and then into a sphere. The paste was plant-based, chosen for availability and low mass, and applied with close attention to seam overlap to minimize hydrogen leakage. The suspension ring included wood elements sealed against moisture and light metal fittings drilled for the attachment of ballast, regulator wires, and bomb racks. The aneroid-controlled ballast carousel, primitive by later aerospace standards, acted as a crude autopilot for vertical control. The operational altitude band, reconstructed from barometer settings and performance models, lay near 30 to 40,000 feet. The diurnal cycle of solar heating and nocturnal cooling, combined with leakage rates and turbulence, created a characteristic sawtooth altitude trace that ballast drops attempted to smooth. A final sequence armed small demolition charges intended to destroy the rig after the ballast was exhausted. This aim was only partly fulfilled, which is why any comprehensive museum exhibit today can display real components rather than rely on drawings alone. The payloads varied within a narrow range. A common configuration paired one relatively small, high-explosive bomb with several incendiary canisters containing thermite or black powder formulations designed to ignite canopy fuels. Fuses were simple and frequently failed to operate on soft impact. Winter ground conditions lowered the probability of ignition even when fuses functioned as designed. Some racks carried incendiaries alone. Analyses of fragment distribution around several landfalls found little consistency in burn patterns, underscoring the role of chance in whether a given device did more than scorch a small patch of ground. The program had a repeatable physics but did not have repeatable effects on impact. The scientific history of the jet stream, a term not yet standardized in wartime field memos, furnished a parallel narrative. Japanese meteorologist Wasaburo Oishi had described persistent high-altitude westerlies over Japan in the 1920s using pilot balloons and published results in Esperanto, a choice that limited dissemination but did not erase the finding. American and European upper air programs had accumulated their own evidence before the war, and wartime radio sonde networks made the structure and seasonal migration of the current in the North Pacific an operational fact for aviation. The balloon campaign did not discover the jet stream. It exploited a well-established feature whose timing and latitude could be predicted with useful fidelity on monthly scales. The same predictability imposed a constraint. The strongest winds fell in the season least favorable to forest fires spread in the American Northwest. Canadian responses proceeded along lines broadly similar to those in the United States. The Royal Canadian Air Force issued circulars to station commanders outlining reporting procedures for drifting balloons and debris. Provincial forestry services expanded lookout duties in winter and early spring, with particular emphasis on days when Chinook and outflow winds dried surface fuels on leeward slopes. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police coordinated with the Army on disposal. Ordnance detachments traveled long distances on poor winter roads to neutralize recoveries. Reports documented landfalls and fragments in British Columbia's interior, the Caribou and Chilcotin plateaus, and as far east as the Prairie provinces. Canadian newspapers operated under similar discretion guidelines and later pivoted to published warnings that resembled American notices after the first fatal U.S. incident clarified the public safety priority. One of the most significant U.S. adaptations, largely absent from early summaries and later recognized in specialized histories, involved a newly reassigned airborne unit. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, an all-black formation known as the Triple Nickles, period spelling, transitioned in 1945 from conventional parachute training to smoke jumping in the Pacific Northwest under what the Army called Operation Firefly. The mission centered on rapid response to forest fires with potential balloon origins during the late spring and summer shoulder season. The battalion deployed detachments to Oregon and California, conducted hundreds of training and operational jumps, and integrated Army airborne procedures with Forest Service doctrine. The unit's record emphasized safety discipline, cross-agency coordination, and an incident report style that reflected both military and forestry cultures. The historical significance of the 555th's role lies partly in the practical contribution to suppression capacity and partly in the demonstration that home front defense could include technically demanding missions for units whose talents had been constrained by segregation elsewhere in the war. The Hanford power line incident in March 1945, in which a balloon apparatus caused a brief fault in transmission lines serving the plutonium production complex, illustrates how a light weapon can intersect with heavy infrastructure in ways planners did not fully anticipate. The system's protection schemes, including automatic reclosures and redundant capacity, contained the disturbance. Internal reviews added specific notes about unusual line faults observed during the season and recommended continued liaison with military and civil agencies tracking balloon falls. No subsequent outage of comparable relevance was traced to a balloon, but the event remains a canonical example in discussions of stochastic hazards to critical grids. Material forensics, an interdisciplinary exercise involving chemists, geologists, and biologists, produced results that were modest individually and decisive in aggregate. Adhesive residues matched plant starch pastes, common to East Asian paper-making rather than synthetic resins. The paper fibers exhibited characteristics of Japanese production. Ballast sand contained diatom and foraminifera species consistent with specific Pacific shorelines supporting launch origin in Japan and not on ocean-going rafts or submarines nearer to North America. Valve alloys and machining signatures aligned with Japanese industrial practice under wartime constraints. The convergence of these findings allowed agencies to brief policymakers with confidence about origin, construction method, and intent without recovering a complete intact system in perfect condition. The Office of Censorship's documentary Trail offers a close view of balancing acts that recur in emergencies. Early notices to editors framed balloon reports as potential intelligence for the adversary and urged restraint. After the Bly tragedy, the office authorized straightforward public warnings that emphasized hazard recognition and non-contact without operational detail. The change coincided with a broader recognition that, by May 1945, the launch program was tapering and that the principal risk to civilians had shifted from fires to accidental detonation of recoveries. The cumulative effect of the censorship posture is visible in later war diaries kept by Japanese planners which lacked accurate feedback on landfall distribution and impact. The absence of a reporting signal across the ocean confirmed that the restraint policy achieved one of its aims. American fire statistics for the winter and spring of 1944-45 show no large anomaly attributable to the campaign. Small increases in off-season ignitions in some districts map onto the known scatter of balloon incidents but do not dominate the baseline driven by lightning, human activity, and debris burning. Where balloon-related fires did occur, they were generally contained at small acreage by standard initial attack tactics. The Forest Service's procurement records list additional cache equipment, purchases, backpack pumps, Pulaski tools, and hose lengths charged to wartime contingency accounts, but the totals remain low relative to late summer fire seasons in other years of the decade. In seasonal terms, the campaign was ill-timed for its stated incendiary effect. The legal and administrative footprint was more pronounced than the fire record. County coroners created provisional categories for explosion-related fatalities and injuries of unknown origin. State police labs expanded photographic documentation procedures for unusual wreckage. Ordnance disposal units formalized checklists for remote response that later became standard for unexploded ordnance, UXO, calls in peacetime. Insurance carriers quietly updated policy language to handle claims arising from off-season fires and blast damage not tied to industrial accidents. None of these adjustments drew public attention at the time. All became part of the institutional memory that would be useful during later decades when other forms of UXO and military debris turned up in civilian settings. The geography of the incidents helps explain the public's uneven awareness. The highest densities of recoveries occurred in sparsely populated forest and rangeland, where discovery depended on patrols, logging operations, ranch work, hunting, or winter recreation. Urban centers experienced the campaign primarily through abstract notices and, in one region, through a brief power disturbance that never reached the threshold of a citywide blackout. The fatal event near Bly, because it involved civilians on a weekend outing and because it occurred in a recognizable recreational landscape, generalized the hazard for many readers who had previously treated balloon stories as remote. Memorialization at that site fixed the episode in regional and national memory in a way that scattered, non-injury incidents could not. Post-war interrogation reports from Japanese launch and engineering personnel describe an enterprise that was organized, resourceful, and bounded by shortages that could not be wished away. Hydrogen production, envelope assembly, and field launch units operated at capacity for several months, then degraded as supply and weather windows narrowed. The altitude control method, though clever, had inherent scatter, and the inability to confirm landfalls robbed planners of any opportunity to refine payload combinations or release schedules. Some retained a retrospective respect for the physical elegance of the concept. Most conceded that the absence of feedback made the campaign an experiment extended past its logical end. Launch counts ceased in the late spring as priorities and resources shifted to other theaters and as the national situation deteriorated. Subsequent decades added a postscript of occasional discovery. In the 1950s and 1960s, hikers and road crews in the American West and Western Canada found corroded components in remote terrain. Ordnance teams destroyed several late-found explosive units in place. Museums accessioned inert fragments. Periodic public reminders advised hunters and loggers not to handle unusual metal cylinders or laminated paper remains. The residual hazard declined with time as explosives degraded, but prudence remained the norm. The Smithsonian and regional museums curated small exhibits that paired objects with maps of known landfalls and diagrams of the jet stream, translating a wartime physics lesson into a public history display. The episode's placement in military historiography reinforced several broad lessons. The first concerns the interplay between natural systems and weapon design. Environmental delivery becomes attractive when the medium offers scale at low marginal cost. It becomes effective only when designers can reconcile the medium's variability with the target's vulnerability. The North Pacific jet stream could carry thousands of envelopes across an ocean. The American West's winter fuels and sparse population limited what those envelopes could do on arrival. The second lesson concerns measurement. A system that cannot sense its results cannot improve them. The third concerns home front management. Institutions that already exist for routine hazards, forestry patrols, county law enforcement, utility dispatch, public information, can absorb a novel hazard when it resembles a more familiar one, provided the technical assistance and disposal capacity are available. Several comparative cases from other theaters clarify these points. In Europe, V-weapons represented a different balance of scale, precision, and feedback. They were expensive, closely observed by both sides, and refined through data. The balloon campaign was cheap, blind, and indifferent to precision beyond continent-scale landfall. In the Pacific, submarine warfare against Japanese shipping combined environmental knowledge with persistent sensing and command feedback, yielding a cumulative effect that warped the adversary's economy. The balloon's misaligned environment and objective. They employed a current tuned to season and latitude against a target set that did not burn or crowd in those months. As a technical demonstration unmanned lift, altitude control by ballast and vent, autonomous timing. It was notable. As a war instrument, it lacked leverage. Meteorological practice absorbed the jet stream lesson permanently. Pilots planning trans-Pacific flights now consider upper air winds as a matter of routine fuel and time management. Radio sonde networks, satellite soundings, and numerical models produce daily charts of the same current that once ferried paper and hydrogen across an ocean. The continuity of the wind, contrasted with the discontinuity of wartime uses to which it was put, is one reason the episode continues to appear in aviation weather courses and museum panels. The atmosphere remains indifferent. Human framing changes. At the level of local memory, the episode persisted in small artifacts and practices. County archives retain photographs in which a boot toe and a ruler provide scale next to warped valves and ring segments. Forest districts keep winter lookout instructions that include a brief note on historical off-season fire sources. Utility maintenance manuals carry sidebars on unusual line faults recorded during the 1944-45 winter, folded into a broader culture of redundancy and fault isolation. School curricula reference the case when teaching hazard recognition around unexploded military debris. Volunteer fire organizations occasionally include a paragraph on the campaign in orientation materials, not because a recurrence is expected, but because the story links seasonal readiness to a distinct historical cause. The fatal arithmetic 6 dead in a single incident makes the campaign statistically small in a war defined by mass casualty events. Its importance in the American mainland story lies in the way it tested communications, interagency cooperation, and the capacity to hold two thoughts simultaneously: that the hazard was real, and that amplifying its visibility could improve the adversary's aim. The United States and Canada chose a path that shifted over time from near silence to cautions that reduced curiosity-driven injury risk. The sequence appears in editor files, radio scripts, and Office of Censorship bulletins. It is a rare example where the public record preserves, in adjacent folders, the before and after of a policy pivot. The Japanese record, viewed with the distance of decades, reads as an assertion that physics could compensate for material scarcity. The assertion was partly correct in the launch phase and fatally incomplete in the outcomes phase. The campaign earned a place in the long catalogue of wartime improvisations that exhibited ingenuity without producing proportionate results. The human labor invested in lamination, seam inspection, assembly, and field launch is visible in photographs and in surviving components where brush strokes and paste ridges remain. Those details trace the cost of making thousands of artifacts whose journey and effects would be, by design, invisible to their makers. In the immediate post-war years, ordnance disposal learned to treat the balloon debris as a particular species within the larger genus of UXO. Procedures focused on perimeter control, remotely applied disruption, and an assumption of instability in fusing and small demolition circuits. These methods became routine and eventually generalized to other classes of abandoned munitions. Public safety messaging, refined during the 1945 pivot, persisted as a template for later warnings about military debris, wildfire starts, and industrial spills. Recognize, avoid, report. The campaign's data also found a second life in academic studies of transoceanic transport. Environmental scientists used landfall distributions to validate conceptual models of long-range dispersal, an early instance of what later generations would call accidental tracer experiments. The balloons, unintended as scientific probes, contributed to understanding of how air masses connect continents. That contribution did not excuse the weapon's purpose or erase its consequences. It offered a collateral insight that meteorologists and geographers acknowledged in footnotes and appendices. The memorial near Bly established the ethical contour of the story. Technical narratives about jet-level winds, ballast regulators, and forensic sand share space with a simple plaque naming the dead. Historical writing that omits this junction risks treating the campaign as a curiosity. Writing that omits the technical and administrative work risks treating it as a legend. The balanced account joins the physics to the policy, and both to the people who occupied the landscapes onto which the weapon fell. By late 1945, the administrative machinery that had managed the hazard stood down. Temporary file headings were merged into general categories. Procurement lines for off-season firefighting supplies returned to ordinary levels. The Western Defense Command reduced the weight assigned to balloon reports in filter centers. The Office of Censorship itself wound down, its wartime role complete. The balloons remained in the record as a completed episode with occasional aftershocks in the form of delayed discoveries. In the end, the campaign's ledger fits on a page, but the narrative fills many. Approximately 9,000 launched, roughly 300 documented incidents across 3 countries, 1 fatal American event with 6 dead, 1 notable interaction with a strategic power facility that did not rise to an emergency, a modest number of off-season fires, a set of museum cases, a batch of laboratory reports on paper, paste, sand, and valves, a trail of internal memos about censorship and public safety, a training chapter for an airborne unit turned smokejumpers, and a body of regional memory anchored to a forest road and a plaque. The wind was the same before, during, and after. Human designs that enlisted it for war passed through and left their artifacts to be weighed, photographed, and explained. The continuation of the historical narrative extends by turning briefly to comparative risk and policy reflections drawn by agencies after the fact. Emergency management reviews in the late 1940s and 1950s categorized the balloon episode under low-frequency, low-consequence, high-uncertainty hazards, a class that also included rare industrial releases and volcanic ashfalls. Recommendations stressed liaison among forestry, utilities, law enforcement, and military disposal units, preservation of specialized response capacity even when event rates were low, and the value of forensic science in resolving origin and mechanism without sensational framing. These reviews also emphasized that suppression of public information, even when justified, should be reconsidered promptly when the hazard shifts from operational secrecy to civilian safety, as occurred in May 1945. Maps compiled after the war, particularly those assembled by the Army Air Forces and the U.S. Forest Service, illustrate distribution with clarity. Pins march eastward from coastal states into the interior west, with a long, sparse tail to the upper Midwest. Canadian pins mirror the pattern along latitude bands. The alignment with modeled jet stream cores for the relevant months validates what meteorologists already knew. The spread around the core reflects day-to-day variability in upper air steering and the stochastic influences of leakage and ballast drop timing. Each pin represents a report, a patrol, a cautious approach, a call, a photograph, and a disposal. These are small acts, but they fill the operational canvas on which broader strategies leave only a faint wash. The episode's cultural presence is quiet but persistent. Local museums employ it to teach that remote wars can produce local artifacts. Forestry education uses it to connect meteorology with fuel conditions. Aviation weather instructors cite it to personalize a chart that might otherwise seem abstract. The memorial anchors it with names. In these settings, the absence of dramatization is a feature. The power of the story lies in its scale and restraint. A paper envelope rose into a known wind, crossed an ocean, and fell into a landscape that already possessed institutions capable of managing what it could do. A final analytical point completes the continuation. The campaign is sometimes framed as a failure. On strategic terms, that is correct. It did not disrupt American industry, fracture public morale, or force large reallocations of defensive resources. As an experiment in environmental delivery, it proved feasibility and disproved operational value under the conditions available to its designers. As a case in home front administration, it demonstrates that modest, distributed institutions, forestry crews, county offices, laboratories, editors, can carry a share of national defense without spectacle. As a human story, it concentrates most of its weight in one loss near a small town. These truths coexist without contradiction. The wind over the North Pacific persists, as it did in 1944-45, recorded hourly now by satellites and profilers. It still moves air masses and aircraft along the same corridors that once carried paper and hydrogen. The war ended, the current did not. The historical narrative therefore concludes not with the wind's disappearance, but with a ledger and a set of practices. The ledger is concise, the practices are durable. They include careful reporting, forensics grounded in ordinary science, restrained public communication that can pivot rapidly when circumstances change, interagency trust built on routine, and memorials that state plainly what numbers alone cannot. This is how a quiet offensive across an ocean becomes, in the long view, a chapter in administrative history, a lesson in applied meteorology, and a local story fixed to a particular clearing in a forest. The continuation affirms the same conclusion reached by the earlier sections. Environmental scale without feedback creates motion without leverage. The decisive actions happen on the ground, in ledgers, in labs, and in the habits of people who notice unusual fragments and choose to call before they touch.